Captain Jake Morrison felt his ship shake as the massive alien vessel pulled them inside with some kind of energy beam. The small human exploration ship called Pioneer had been scanning what looked like an empty space station when everything went wrong. Now they were trapped inside something bigger than 3 city blocks put together and made of dark metal that seemed to eat light. Jake looked at his crew of 5 people. Dr. Lisa Parker sat at her science station trying to understand the readings on her screen. Lieutenant Ben Collins checked his weapons, but they all knew their small guns would not help much against whatever had captured them. Engineer Tony Rodriguez worked fast to shut down their engines before the alien technology could damage them. The other 2 crew members stayed quiet and waited for orders. The ship stopped moving with a loud clang that echoed through the walls. Jake could hear heavy footsteps outside their hull getting closer and closer. Then came sounds like metal being cut apart as something opened their ship from the outside. Jake told his crew to put their hands up and show they meant no harm. Tatars. Airlock door exploded inward and creatures walked through that made Jake want to step backward. They stood 9 feet tall with thick armor covering their bodies that looked like it grew from their skin. Their faces had 4 eyes that glowed red and mouths full of sharp teeth. Each one carried weapons that hummed with energy and looked like they could cut through steel. The creatures spoke in voices that sounded like rocks grinding together, but somehow Jake could understand them. A device on his belt was translating their words. They ordered the humans to come out with their hands visible and move slowly. Jake led his crew out of their damaged ship and into a massive hangar filled with more alien vessels than he could. Count guards pushed them through corridors wide enough for trucks to drive through. The walls showed pictures of battles and conquests with these same creatures standing over defeated enemies. Jake noticed that all the beaten enemies in the pictures were much smaller than their captors, just like humans were now. They entered a room so large it could hold a football stadium. At the far end sat the biggest creature Jake had ever seen on a throne made from what looked like the bones of some giant animal. This creature wore more armor than the others and had scars across its face that told stories of many battles. When it spoke, the whole room seemed to shake. The creature called itself General Zexthok of the Korthak Empire. It looked down at the humans like a person might look at insects and started to laugh. The sound was horrible, like breaking glass mixed with thunder. The general told his warriors that these tiny soft creatures were supposed to be intelligent life, but they looked more like pets than soldiers. Jake stepped forward and spoke with as much strength as he could find in his voice. He said they were explorers from Earth and meant no harm to anyone. He asked to be treated according to the laws of war and for his crew to be returned safely to their home world. This made the general laugh even harder until tears came from its 4 red eyes. General Zexthok stood up from his throne and walked down to where the humans waited. Even Jake, who was 6 feet tall, only came up to the creature's chest. The general reached out with one clawed hand and touched Jake's head like he was petting a small animal. It said humans were so tiny and weak that killing them would bring no honor, but keeping them might provide entertainment for the troops. The general called for his science officer and ordered tests to be done on the humans. It wanted to know how such small, weak creatures had managed to build ships that could travel between stars. The general said it would be interesting to study them before his fleet moved on to conquer their home world. When Jake heard this, his blood turned cold, but he kept his face calm and did not let the aliens see his fear. Dr. Parker whispered that she was picking up signals from dozens of other ships connected to this one. Ben Collins quietly counted the number of guards and looked for possible escape routes. Tony Rodriguez studied the alien technology around them, trying to understand how it worked. Jake knew his crew was already thinking about how to get out of this situation and warn Earth about the danger coming their way. General Zexthok ordered the humans to be taken to holding cells, but told his guards to be careful not to break them too quickly. It wanted to see what these strange little creatures could do when faced with proper Korthak warriors. The general's laughter followed them as they were marched away to whatever fate awaited them in the depths of the alien warship. The cell they put Jake and his crew in was built for creatures much larger than humans. The bars were thick as telephone poles, and the space between them was wide enough for a person to stick their arm through. Jake figured the Korthak had never captured anything as small as a human before because their prison seemed designed to hold giants. 3 days passed before General Zexthok came to visit them again. The giant alien looked down at the humans through the bars and smiled with too many sharp teeth. It announced that the troops were getting bored during their long journey to conquer new worlds and needed entertainment. The general had decided that watching tiny humans fight proper warriors would be amusing for everyone. Jake felt his stomach drop, but kept his voice steady when he asked what kind of fighting the general meant. Zexthok explained that the Korthak had a tradition of gladiator battles where prisoners could earn better treatment by showing courage in combat. Of course, the general added, with another horrible laugh, no prisoner had ever actually won such a fight, but the attempts were always entertaining. Dr. Parker grabbed Jake's arm and whispered that this was just murder disguised as sport. Ben Collins clenched his fists and said they should refuse to participate. But Jake knew they had no choice because the alternative was probably immediate death for all of them. At least this way they might learn more about Korthak weaknesses and maybe find a chance to escape. The next morning, guards came to take Jake to what they called the combat arena. They gave him basic armor that was too big for his human body and a sword that felt heavy in his hands. The weapon was made for creatures with longer arms and more strength, but Jake had trained with many different weapons during his military service, so he tried to adjust his grip and stance. The arena was another massive room filled with hundreds of Korthak soldiers, cheering and making noise like wild animals. Jake walked out onto sandy ground stained dark with the blood of previous fighters who had not survived their entertainment. Across from him came his opponent, a Korthak warrior, who stood nearly 10 feet tall and wore armor that covered everything except his 4 glowing eyes. General Zexthok stood up in his viewing box high above the arena and announced the rules. The human would fight until he could no longer continue, and if he somehow managed to hurt his opponent, the general might consider giving him a quick death instead of a slow one. The crowd roared with laughter at this generous offer. The Korthak warrior charged at Jake swinging a massive sword that could cut a human in half with one blow. Jake barely rolled out of the way, feeling the weapon pass so close to his head that it cut some of his hair. The crowd cheered, thinking the fight would end quickly, but Jake had other plans. During his years as a soldier, Jake had learned that speed could beat strength and smart thinking could beat size. While the Korthak warrior struggled to turn his heavy body around, Jake moved behind him and struck at the back of his opponent's knee, where the armor had a small gap. The blow was not deep, but it made the creature stumble, and the crowd grew quieter. Jake kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for the bigger opponent to land a solid hit. He studied the way the Korthak fought and noticed that all their moves followed patterns like they had been trained to fight enemies their own size. The warrior kept swinging his sword in wide arcs, trying to cut Jake in half, but hitting only empty air while Jake stayed low and struck at weak points in the armor. After 10 minutes, the Korthak warrior was breathing hard and bleeding from several small wounds. Jake was tired too, but he could see confusion in his opponent's 4 red eyes. This was not going the way anyone had expected, including General Zexthok, who had stopped laughing and was leaning forward in his seat to watch more carefully. Jake saw his chance when the warrior raised his sword for another powerful downward strike. Instead of dodging sideways like before, Jake stepped forward inside the arc of the swing and drove his own blade up through a gap in the chest armor. The Korthak warrior made a sound like steam escaping and fell backward onto the sand. The entire arena went completely silent for several seconds. Then General Zexthok began to clap slowly while the crowd made confused noises. The general announced that the tiny human had provided unexpected entertainment, but surely this was just luck that would not happen again. Tomorrow there would be another fight with a more experienced warrior. Guards escorted Jake back to his cell, where his crew waited with worried faces. Dr. Parker examined his wounds, while Ben Collins asked about what he had learned. Jake told them the Korthak were strong and tough, but they fought like machines following programmed responses. They had never faced an enemy who was faster and smarter instead of bigger and stronger. Tony Rodriguez had been busy while Jake was fighting. He had figured out how to access some of the ship's computer systems through maintenance panels in their cell. The information he found was terrifying. The Korthak fleet was heading toward Earth with enough firepower to destroy every major city. They planned to enslave any humans who survived and strip the planet of all useful resources. Jake knew they had to find a way to escape and warn Earth about what was coming. But first, he had to survive more fights in the arena while his crew worked on finding weaknesses in Korthak technology and security. The general might think human victory was just luck, but Jake planned to show him how wrong that assumption really was. Jake won his second fight, and then his third. Each time, General Zexthok's laughter grew quieter, and his 4 red eyes grew more focused on the small human, who kept defeating warriors twice his size. The other Korthak soldiers were starting to whisper among themselves about how their mighty fighters kept falling to this tiny creature from an unknown world. By the 5th fight, Jake had learned to read Korthak body language and predict their attacks before they happened. Dr. Parker had been studying the alien warriors from her cell and discovered that all Korthak had the same weak spots in their armor and the same blind angles in their vision. She drew diagrams showing Jake exactly where to strike for maximum effect with minimum effort. Ben Collins had been counting guards and timing their patrol routes while Tony Rodriguez continued hacking into ship systems. They learned the layout of the massive vessel and found that most security was designed to keep large enemies out rather than small ones in. The Korthak had never imagined that prisoners might be small enough to crawl through ventilation shafts or slip between barrier supports. General Zexthok was getting angry about Jake's continued victories. The troops were placing bets on the human instead of cheering for their own kind, and some had even started calling Jake by a Korthak word that meant giant killer. The general decided it was time to end this embarrassment before it damaged morale any further. The general announced that Jake would face Warrior Prime Kexmore, who had never lost a single battle in 200 fights. This massive Korthak stood 11 feet tall and wore armor made from the shells of creatures he had personally killed. His weapon was not just a sword, but an energy blade that could cut through almost anything, including the arena walls themselves. Jake knew this fight would be different from all the others. Kexmore did not charge wildly like the previous opponents, but moved with careful steps, studying Jake's movements and waiting for the right moment to strike. When the Warrior Prime finally attacked, his blade moved faster than Jake had ever seen, and only a desperate roll saved him from being cut in half. The crowd was cheering again as their champion pressed his attack. Kexmore fought with skill and intelligence instead of just brute strength, and Jake found himself being pushed backward around the arena. Every time he tried to get close enough to strike, the energy blade forced him away, and he could feel his strength starting to fade from the constant movement. Jake noticed that the arena had environmental controls built into the walls, probably, to create different fighting conditions for variety. While dodging another deadly swing, he managed to hit a control panel with his elbow, and suddenly thick fog began pouring from vents in the ceiling. The crowd made angry noises as their view became blocked, but Jake smiled for the first time since the fight began. In the fog, Kexmore's size became a disadvantage because he could not see Jake, but Jake could hear exactly where the big warrior was moving. Jake used the sound of heavy footsteps and labored breathing to track his opponent while staying silent himself. When Kexmore swung his energy blade at sounds, Jake was no longer there. Jake found another control panel and changed the arena lighting to a strobe pattern that flashed bright and dark every few seconds. This confused Kexmore even more because Korthak eyes were designed for steady light, and the flashing made it hard for him to judge distances. Jake had trained in similar conditions during night combat exercises, so he adapted much faster than his opponent. Moving like a shadow, Jake got behind Kexmore during one of the dark phases and struck at the Warrior Prime's neck, where Dr. Parker had identified a critical nerve cluster. The blow was perfectly placed and Kexmore collapsed to the arena floor unconscious, but still alive. Jake had won again, but this time he had done it without killing his opponent. The arena erupted in chaos. Some Korthak cheered while others roared in anger. General Zexthok stood up with rage burning in all four eyes and declared that the human had cheated by using the arena equipment. But his own rules had never forbidden such tactics, and now he looked foolish for complaining about his prisoner's intelligence. During the confusion, Ben Collins activated the escape plan they had been preparing. Tony Rodriguez had programmed a system overload that would cause temporary power failures throughout the ship. When the lights went out in the arena, Jake ran toward the exit where his crew was waiting with stolen guard uniforms and weapons. They fought their way through corridors, filled with confused Korthak soldiers who were trying to restore power and find out what was happening. Jake's combat experience and Ben's tactical training helped them avoid the heaviest resistance, while Tony led them toward the hangar where their damaged ship waited. Dr. Parker had downloaded massive amounts of data about Korthak technology and battle plans during the power failure. The information she gathered would be crucial for warning Earth about the invasion fleet heading their way. But first they had to escape from a ship full of angry aliens who wanted them dead. They reached the hangar as emergency power came back online. Guards were already surrounding their ship, but Jake had one more surprise for the Korthak. He activated grenades they had taken from dead guards and threw them at the hangar's atmospheric controls. The explosions did not damage the ship, but they created a breach that sucked air out into space. The Korthak guards were pulled toward the breach by the rushing air, but Jake and his crew had magnetic clamps on their stolen uniforms that held them in place. They reached their ship and sealed themselves inside while the hangar automatically closed emergency blast doors to stop the air leak. Tony got their engines running while Ben handled weapons, and Dr. Parker uploaded all her stolen data to their computers. Jake took the pilot controls and pushed their small ship toward the hangar exit, knowing that dozens of Korthak fighters would be waiting outside to destroy them. But they had learned enough about alien technology to have a few tricks ready for that fight, too. Jake pushed their stolen ship to maximum speed while Korthak fighters swarmed after them like angry hornets. The alien vessels were faster and had better weapons, but they were also much larger and less able to change direction quickly. Jake used every trick he had learned as a military pilot to stay ahead of the energy blasts, trying to destroy them. Ben Collins worked the defensive systems, while Tony Rodriguez tried to squeeze more power from engines that were already running beyond their design limits. Dr. Parker analyzed the Korthak data she had stolen and made discoveries that could save Earth if they survived long enough to deliver the information. The chase lasted for 6 hours across empty space before Jake managed to lose their pursuers in an asteroid field. The Korthak ships were too big to follow safely between the floating rocks, so they gave up and returned to their fleet. Jake set course for Earth, knowing they had maybe 2 weeks before General Zexthok's invasion force reached human space. During the long journey home, Dr. Parker shared what she had learned about Korthak technology and biology. Their armor was incredibly strong, but it conducted certain sound frequencies that could cause pain and disorientation. Their ships had massive firepower, but poor maneuverability because they were designed to overwhelm enemies through brute force, rather than tactical skill. Most importantly, she had discovered the invasion plans. General Zexthok commanded a fleet of 300 warships, carrying enough soldiers to occupy every major city on Earth. They planned to destroy military targets first, then demand surrender from civilian governments. Any resistance would result in the complete destruction of entire countries as examples to others. When they finally reached Earth's solar system, Jake sent emergency signals to every military base and government facility he could contact. At first, nobody believed their story, because it sounded too much like science fiction. But when they transmitted the Korthak data and showed recordings of the alien technology, officials began to take them seriously. Admiral Kate Williams of Earth Defense Command met with Jake and his crew at a secure military facility. She listened to their report with growing alarm as she realized how unprepared humanity was for this threat. Earth had orbital defense platforms and a small fleet of military ships, but nothing that could match the firepower of a Korthak battle. Cruiser Ben Collins briefed the Admiral on Korthak military tactics, while Tony Rodriguez worked with Earth's top engineers to understand the alien technology. They learned that humanity's weapons would barely scratch Korthak armor, and their ships would be destroyed in any direct confrontation. Traditional military strategy would lead to quick defeat and the enslavement of the entire human race. But Dr. Parker had found weaknesses that could be exploited. She showed Earth scientists how to build devices that generated the specific sound frequencies that disrupted Korthak nervous systems. She also discovered that their energy shields had blind spots that could be targeted by weapons fired from precise angles. Jake insisted that Earth's defense plans should avoid direct battles and focus on guerrilla tactics instead. He had seen how the Korthak fought and knew they expected enemies to meet them with equal force. They would not be prepared for hit-and-run attacks or for enemies who used the environment as a weapon. Admiral Williams authorized crash programs to retrofit human ships with the new weapons Dr. Parker had designed. Military bases around the world began training soldiers in the tactics Jake recommended based on his arena experience. Earth had 2 weeks to prepare for the most important battle in human history. Scientists worked day and night to build enough sonic weapons to equip entire armies. Engineers modified fighter planes to exploit the blind spots in Korthak shields. Military planners studied every piece of data the crew had brought back and developed strategies that played to humanity's strengths instead of trying to match alien advantages. Jake spent his time training other pilots in the techniques he had, used to escape from the Korthak fleet. He taught them how to use speed and agility to avoid the heavy weapons that could destroy them in one hit. He showed them how to think like smaller predators hunting much larger prey. Dr. Parker worked with weapons designers to create specialized ammunition that would be most effective against Korthak armor. She also developed portable versions of the sonic disruptor that individual soldiers could carry into battle. Every human fighter would have tools specifically designed to hurt creatures that seemed almost invincible. Tony Rodriguez helped upgrade Earth's communication systems so military units could coordinate attacks across the entire planet. The Korthak expected to face scattered resistance that could be defeated separately, but instead, they would encounter a unified global defense force, sharing information and supporting each other. As the deadline approached, everyone knew the odds were still heavily against human survival. The Korthak had conquered dozens of worlds, and their technology was centuries ahead of anything Earth possessed. But Jake had proven in the arena that size and strength could be beaten by intelligence and determination. Admiral Williams held a final briefing for military commanders from every nation on Earth. She told them that the coming battle would decide whether humanity remained free or became slaves to an alien empire. The enemy expected easy victory against a primitive species, but they would learn the same lesson General Zexthok had learned when he laughed at a tiny soldier. Long-range sensors detected the Korthak invasion fleet approaching the outer edge of the solar system. 300 massive warships moved toward Earth, like a dark cloud bringing death and destruction. But this time the humans knew they were coming and had prepared surprises that no Korthak warrior had ever faced before. The Korthak invasion fleet arrived exactly when Dr. Parker's calculations predicted they would. 300 massive warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system and began moving toward the blue planet that General Zexthok had marked for conquest. The alien general stood on his command bridge, looking at tactical displays that showed no significant resistance waiting for his forces. Admiral Williams watched the enemy approach from her command center deep inside a mountain where Earth's defense forces had gathered. Every nation had contributed their best pilots and soldiers to this final battle for human freedom. The admiral opened communication channels to military units around the world and spoke words that would be remembered forever if anyone survived to remember them. She told her forces that today was the day humanity would prove that courage could defeat superior technology and that intelligence could overcome brute force. She reminded them that every person on Earth was counting on them to protect their families and their future. Then she gave the order that began the most important battle in human history. Captain Amy Foster led the first wave of modified fighter planes against the approaching Korthak fleet. Her squadron had trained for weeks to exploit the blind spots Dr. Parker had identified in alien shield systems. They came at the enemy warships from angles the Korthak had never seen before, using hit-and-run tactics that Jake Morrison had taught them. The Korthak expected human ships to approach in formation for a traditional space battle, but instead they faced swarms of small fighters attacking from all directions. Amy's pilots struck at specific points on enemy hulls, where the shields could not protect them, then vanished before the heavy alien weapons could target them. Each attack caused small amounts of damage, but there were hundreds of attacks happening. At the same time, General Zexthok watched his tactical displays with growing frustration as human fighters buzzed around his massive ships like angry insects. His gunners could not hit targets that moved so unpredictably, and his ship commanders were confused by enemy tactics they had never encountered. The general ordered his fleet to ignore the small fighters and proceed directly to Earth, where they would destroy major cities as planned. But Admiral Williams had prepared for this response. As the Korthak ships entered the inner solar system, they encountered the second phase of human defense. Commander Steve Hayes led ground-based missile batteries that fired weapons guided by the most advanced targeting computers on Earth. These missiles carried warheads built according to Dr. Parker's specifications designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Korthak technology. The missiles struck Korthak shields at precisely calculated frequencies that caused resonance failures. For the first time in their military history, Korthak ships began taking serious damage from enemies they considered primitives. Several smaller vessels were destroyed completely, and even the massive battle cruisers showed signs of hull breaches and system failures. General Zexthok realized that somehow the humans had learned the secrets of Korthak technology and were using that knowledge against him. He thought about the escaped prisoners, especially the small soldier who had defeated his best warriors in gladiatorial combat. The general began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake by underestimating these creatures. Jake Morrison flew his own fighter in the third wave of attacks alongside pilots he had personally trained. They carried the new sonic weapons that Dr. Parker had developed based on her study of Korthak biology. When these weapons struck alien ships, they sent sound waves through the hulls that caused pain and disorientation to every Korthak on board. The effect was devastating because Korthak military doctrine had never prepared them for attacks that bypassed their armor and shields to strike directly at their nervous systems. Alien soldiers collapsed at their posts, while their officers struggled to maintain control of ships that were being torn apart by enemies they could barely see. Tony Rodriguez coordinated the technical aspects of the battle from a communications center where he monitored every human unit engaged with the enemy. He had discovered how to jam Korthak communication systems using their own technology against them. Without coordination between ships, the alien fleet began to fall apart as individual commanders made decisions that conflicted with overall strategy. Dr. Parker worked with weapons technicians to adjust the sonic attacks in real time as they learned more about Korthak responses. She discovered that different frequencies affected different organs, and that combinations of sounds could cause complete system shutdown in alien nervous systems. Each minute of battle provided new information that made human weapons more effective. The turning point came when several Korthak battlecruisers tried to retreat, but found their engines disabled by precisely targeted missile strikes. Other alien ships moved to assist their damaged vessels, but this bunched them together in formations that made them perfect targets for coordinated attacks by human fighter squadrons. General Zexthok watched his fleet being systematically destroyed by enemies he had expected to defeat in a matter of hours. The humans were fighting like the small soldier had fought in the arena, using speed and intelligence to overcome superior size and strength. Every advantage the Korthak possessed was being turned against them by creatures who refused to fight according to traditional rules. The general ordered his personal ship to Earth's surface, where he would lead ground forces in a final assault on human military installations. If he could not win a space battle, then he would prove Korthak's superiority in direct combat on the planet itself. But as his ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, it was met by defenses that no other world had ever prepared. Human soldiers waited in positions designed according to Jake Morrison's recommendations. They carried weapons built to Dr. Parker's specifications, and they were ready to show General Zexthok what happened when someone laughed at creatures who had spent their entire history fighting against impossible odds and winning through determination and clever tactics. General Zexthok's command ship landed in what had once been a forest, but was now a battlefield scarred by the weapons of two different species. The massive alien vessel opened its cargo doors, and thousands of Korthak soldiers marched out wearing their traditional armor and carrying energy weapons that could melt steel. The general himself led them wearing ceremonial battle gear decorated with trophies from 100 conquered worlds. Human forces waited in defensive positions that used Earth's natural terrain to their advantage. Jake Morrison had taught them lessons learned in the gladiator arena about fighting enemies much larger and stronger than themselves. Instead of meeting the aliens in open battle, they used forests and hills and rivers as weapons against creatures who expected their enemies to stand and fight. The first Korthak assault was met by concentrated sonic weapon fire that sent waves of disorienting sound through the alien ranks. Soldiers who had never felt pain from enemy weapons suddenly found themselves unable to stand or coordinate their movements. The advance faltered as warriors fell to their knees, clutching their heads and crying out in confusion. Commander Steve Hayes led human ground forces in hit-and-run attacks that struck the Korthak from unexpected angles, then melted away before the aliens could respond. His soldiers had trained in guerrilla tactics that used every advantage their smaller size provided. They moved through spaces too narrow for Korthak warriors and struck at weak points in alien armor with weapons designed specifically for that purpose. General Zexthok realized that his ground assault was failing just as badly as his space battle had failed. These humans fought nothing like the enemies he had conquered before. They refused to meet his superior force with equal strength and instead used tactics that turned every Korthak advantage into a disadvantage. The general decided that only personal combat could restore his honor and prove Korthak's superiority. Jake Morrison received a direct challenge transmitted on all human communication frequencies. General Zexthok demanded single combat with the small soldier who had escaped from his ship and somehow turned defeat into victory. The alien general promised that if Jake won, the remaining Korthak forces would surrender, but if the general won, then humanity would become slaves to the Korthak Empire. Admiral Williams tried to talk Jake out of accepting the challenge, but he knew this was the only way to end the war quickly. Too many people were dying on both sides, and Earth's defenses could not hold forever against such a large enemy force. Jake agreed to meet the general in personal combat with the understanding that the winner would decide the fate of both species. They met on a hill overlooking the main battlefield where soldiers from both armies could watch their champions fight. General Zexthok stood 11 feet tall in armor that had protected him through 2 centuries of warfare. He carried an energy blade that hummed with power and could cut through almost anything on Earth. Jake wore standard human combat gear and carried weapons that seemed laughably small compared to what his opponent possessed. The general looked down at Jake and began the same horrible laughter that had echoed through the arena when they first met. He said that luck and trickery might work against ordinary soldiers, but they would not save the tiny human against a Korthak general who had conquered 50 worlds. Jake said nothing but studied his opponent's stance and movement patterns, just as he had done in every gladiator fight. When the battle began, General Zexthok attacked with the fury of a creature who had never been defeated in personal combat. His energy blade moved faster than human eyes could follow and struck with enough force to split rocks. But Jake was no longer where the blade fell because he had learned to read Korthak attack patterns and could predict where each strike would land. The general's armor protected him from Jake's weapons, but it also made him slower and less flexible than his smaller opponent. Jake used the same tactics that had won fights in the alien arena, staying mobile and striking at weak points while avoiding direct confrontation with superior firepower. He made the general chase him around obstacles and through terrain that favored speed over strength. As the fight continued, General Zexthok became frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow against such a small target. His energy blade carved through trees and split boulders, but never touched the human who seemed to dance just out of reach. The general's 4 red eyes burned with rage as he realized he was being made to look foolish in front of both armies. Jake saw his opportunity when the general raised his weapon for a massive overhead strike that would have crushed any normal opponent. Instead of dodging sideways, Jake stepped forward inside the arc of the swing and drove his combat knife up through a gap in the ceremonial armor where decorative plates had been attached with weaker materials than the main protection. The blade found the nerve cluster that Dr. Parker had identified in her studies of Korthak anatomy. General Zexthok froze in place as his nervous system was disrupted, then toppled backward like a falling tree. He was not dead, but he could not move or speak, and his weapon fell from paralyzed fingers. Jake stood over his defeated opponent and spoke words that would be remembered as long as humans existed. He said that strength was not measured by size or weapons, but by the courage to fight when victory seemed impossible. He told the watching Korthak soldiers that their general had lost because he laughed at enemies instead of respecting them. The remaining Korthak forces surrendered as their general had promised. Without their leader and with their fleet destroyed, they had no choice but to accept human terms. Jake insisted that the alien soldiers be treated fairly and given the chance to return home if they swore never to attack Earth again. News of the victory spread throughout the galaxy as other species learned that the supposedly invincible Korthak Empire had been defeated by a race they had never heard of before. Worlds that had been conquered by alien forces began to rebel, knowing that liberation was possible. Earth became known as the place where giants had been brought down by creatures who refused to surrender. General Zexthok eventually recovered from his paralysis, but he was no longer the same arrogant commander who had laughed at tiny soldiers. In his final transmission before leaving Earth forever, he admitted that his greatest mistake had been measuring enemies by their size instead of their spirit. He said that humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson about the true nature of strength and courage that would not be forgotten.